Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Andreas Benokratis, and I'm a product manager for Ansible Network Automation, and I'll be your MC today. Today's Ansible Network Automation webinar is being led by Ajay Chenampara and is entitled Ask an Expert, Ansible Network Automation with Command Parsers. Oh boy, this will be a good one. Ajay is a solution architect with Red Hat's public sector team, and he lives in Atlanta. Really excited to have him. Sean Kavanaugh, our typical co-presenter, is on PTO, a well-deserved break for him. But before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Before we get going, all participants, that's you all, will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. So you don't have to worry about being on mute or off mute. But if you do have any questions during the presentation, we ask that you use the questions feature as part of the GoToWebinar app that you have there and ask your question there in text form. We'll try and get to them as we go if there are a lot of questions, and we'll continue to answer some questions at the end of the webinar. Again, and as many questions as we can get as possible, we may run out of time. Last but not least, this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on the Ansible.com training and webinars section by next week. So if you've missed any part of this or you want to replay, send it to your friends and family. We'll have the replay as well as the slides posted, so don't worry. And without further ado, let's kick things off. First, I want to actually talk about a few other public service announcements. We actually have some additional Ansible Automates. The global tour is in full swing. Here are just a few of the cities that we are visiting. This is a free event. Ansible Automates is basically like an Ansible Fest light version. It's a one-day kind of drink from the fire hose if you're new to Ansible. Highly recommend that you check this out. We have a bunch of cities right now. We're a bunch of cities in Asia this week, next week, and we're doing the rounds here actually in Sacramento, Dallas, and Austin. I know that Ajay is actually going to be in Austin, and his teammate Gerald is going to be doing Sacramento and San Diego as well. So if you're interested in learning more, if you're new to Ansible and you want to learn more about it, highly recommend that you check out some of these events here on the global tour. That's ansible.com/automates. Next, more hands-on training. So this is more technical workshops. The workshops are another great event to have. This is local. You would bring your laptop and you learn everything about Ansible and Ansible Tower. This is a one-day event, hands-on, very, very technical. The Ansible Automates is more of a sit-down marketing, understanding how things work with presentations. The technical workshops are more of a hands-on, again, bring your laptop and really start using some playbooks, writing playbooks, understanding how Ansible works, Ansible Tower, etc. There's a bunch of other cities here. Here are just a few that we have: New York, Atlanta twice, and we have Columbus, Ohio. Again, these are network workshops. So again, this webinar is typically for network engineers, network operators. We actually have this workshop is specific for the network folks. So if you're looking at automating, for example, Cisco switches and routers, this is probably a good one to do. If you're a Linux person who want to automate Linux, just normal Linux devices, we actually have workshops just for you as well. So take a look at ansible.com/workshop and you'll find out some more there. Finally, our grand finale, our big event, the big one that we used to call is Ansible Fest. That's in Atlanta. This is now a 3-day event. We had it last year, and we have it again this year in Atlanta. This is all things Ansible with Ansible Fest. Highly recommend that you keep an eye out. We haven't opened up the registrations yet. That should be soon. But we do actually have, if you have a really good Ansible story, we have opened up the call for papers. If you want to speak at this, we actually are opening that up. Take a look, and we would love to have you there as an attendee or as a participant. Lots of cool things. I know it's a little bit early. September is a ways out. We're already starting to plan it, and we're going to have some agendas here probably in the next month or so. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, now let's get down to business. So what are we going to talk about today? Ask an expert. We have this every 3 months, and we talk about a little bit of everything. We got some feedback. We wanted to get some more in-depth, some really meaty technical understanding around how you actually parse facts and how to actually get information out of network devices, and how do we actually use Ansible to actually create and use command parsers to use that information. So we're basically just going to talk about this, and if there's any other general Q&A, we're just going to go from there. So I'm going to actually kick it off to Ajay and have at it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrews. And just before I get started, real quick plug for the Ansible meetups in Atlanta as well, because there was so much of Atlanta in those slides that you presented, and I'm thinking, if any of you guys are based out of Atlanta, we do this meetup once a month. So the next one is May 16th. In fact, the deck that I'm presenting before you was presented in the last Atlanta meetup. So if you attended the meetup, this is probably going to be a little bit redundant content to you. With that, I'll get started with my first slide. Right, the first slide I usually use it to help out my fellow network engineers who are often vilified. Right, so I like to say that whatever the problem is, it is not the network. So try and troubleshoot somewhere else. The next slide, Andrew. So talking about the network command parsers, or parsing blocks of text into structured data, we need to take a quick detour and understand what the Ansible Network Engine is. The Ansible Network Engine by itself can be a deep dive session, but for this particular webinar, I wanted to touch briefly on it just because the command parser depends on the Ansible Network Engine. Next slide. So as Peter Strigata, our distinguished engineer, office of CTO, likes to say, automation is all about taking a layered approach, right? So we all deal with our own brownfield environments, right? So no network engineer or engineer in general has the luxury of working on greenfield environments. And one of the key things that Ansible does is to help glue together the different pieces that already exist in our infrastructure. We might have legacy equipment, we might have a different source of truth, we might have all these different pieces that we are manually using today to manage and configure our network. So Ansible kind of helps form that glue to integrate between these different pieces of equipment. Using that same philosophy, I like to talk about the Ansible Network Engine. Next slide. So the Ansible Network Engine is a set of consumable functions that is brought to users through a Ansible role, right? So Ansible roles are reusable pieces of code that can be downloaded from a central source called Ansible Galaxy, right? So from Ansible Galaxy, people can download and install multiple roles and use these roles within their code. Next slide. So at a high level, just to understand, Ansible role, the Ansible Network Engine is nothing but a Ansible role. When you look at from an architectural standpoint, if you look at it, right? So at the very bottom, you have all your devices that you're trying to automate and manage. So Ansible Engine provides the basic modules and connection plugins that help manage these devices, right? At this point, people who are attending this and who are familiar with Ansible are familiar with Ansible modules and connection plugins. Modules are relatively dumb pieces of code that takes some input, produces some automation artifacts, and generates some output. Right? At a very high level, that's a good way to think about it. Next slide. The network engine adds or layers on to the Ansible engine and provides some higher level functions. These are functions that provide configuration and operations plugins so that it helps make operations a lot more easier. So an example helps tie this a little easier, right? A good example is a VLAN filter plugin, right? So in most network equipment vendor systems, if you look at the VLANs being permitted on a trunk port, it might usually be represented using some sort of a hyphen, right? So if VLANs 1 through 100 are permitted through a trunk port, it might be represented as 1-100. Now, while as a human that can process fuzzy logic, you can read that and it makes sense out of it. But for a program to consume it and then translate that to VLANs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., up to 100, you need some piece of programming to happen there, right? So Network Engine, for instance, provides a VLAN expansion filter that does that for you, right? And this is something that instead of having every single vendor to write that piece of code to expand the VLANs, the Network Engine provides those kind of functions. Another great I guess feature of the Network Engine is the fact that it helps deliver modules and functionality much quicker than the lifecycle of the Ansible engine itself. And next slide. And on top of this, there are more intelligence, right? So a high level of intelligence is built into the network functions. So network functions, you can think of them as providing maybe third-party VPN connectivity, right? Everybody needs to do that. So having a role that just takes a bunch of possible inputs and generates the configuration artifacts for that, that's one of the ways you want to think of network functions. And the reason why I wanted to go through this architecture real quick is because the command parser, which is the topic we're going to talk about today, is being provided by that middle tier, right? That network engine role is necessary in order for us to use the command parser. And we just want to keep that in mind. And that's the reason I'm talking about all these different components. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about the command parser. Next slide. So if you've been using Ansible for network automation for a while now, you already know that we can collect a lot of operational state data from network equipment by using the facts modules. So that could be iOS_facts, NXOS_facts, Junos_facts, and so on and so forth, right? So for every vendor platform, there is a facts module that brings back structured data. But keep in mind that these facts modules are opinionated, right? So there might be a particular show command that you want to use to collect a particular piece of information. How would you do that, right? So how do you deal with custom commands? So next slide, Andrews. So this is an example of a custom command. Let's say you wanted to parse the output of a show IP interface brief on a Cisco iOS device, and you want to collect the interface information, the assigned IPv4 address, its administrative state, and its link state. Okay. Next slide. Another example might be devices that do not have fax modules for them yet. So this slide shows the output of a IKE v1, right? So that's phase 1 tunnel, IPsec tunnel information on an ASA device. Now, as a human being, right, just looking at this as a network engineer, you can kind of, parse the data and tell what's the information that's being sent here, right? So you can say that what's the pure IP, which direction the connection was initiated, what kind of hashing algorithm is used, what is the lifetime, et cetera, right? So this is information that you, as a subject matter expert of network devices and firewalls, can look at this and understand it. But how would you take this information and use that inside some other program as a programmatic entity, right? So that's what we're going to look at. Next slide. The third example might be you're dealing with devices that may not be network equipment, right? So the command parser, even though it comes as part of the Ansible network engine, I think the scope of what it can do is a lot more than just network devices. So this is an example of an ifconfig command on a Linux machine, right? So out of this output, what if you wanted to collect the interface name, the IPv6 and IPv4 addresses, MAC address, et cetera, et cetera. What if you wanted to collect that information, right? So how would you do that? All right, next slide. So the command parser is going to help you do that. So the command parser is nothing but an action plugin right? So just to make sure that that's not a brand new term, all the modules that we use inside Ansible are all action plugins, right? So command parser is just another action plugin that you can use like you would use a module in your playbook. And when you look at an example, that'll make a lot of sense. It uses YAML to build a template. So the command parser is a template, and you can use YAML to write this template. And as a Ansible user, you're already familiar with YAML, so it should not be something too difficult to learn and adapt to. So before command parser, I used to use a Python library called TextFSM, and TextFSM is a very powerful parsing engine, and I'm a huge fan. But for me, one of the biggest drawbacks with TextFSM was the fact that it had its own domain-specific language. And once I wrote a regular expression parser, I would come back and look at it after 6 weeks or 2 weeks, and it would be completely, again, new to me, right? In that regard, I like the command parser because it carries over the same philosophy that Ansible playbooks bring in, right? You can write it once and it's readable, and it makes sense when you revisit those Parser templates after a while. Another key advantage of using the command parser, actually the network engine provides the command parser, and it also provides the TextFSM parser. So if you've already been using TextFSM parsing engine and you've already built a bunch of templates, there is nothing that prevents you from using the Ansible network engine and using its TextFSM parser to reuse those templates. So that's a good thing to have as well. The native integration with the Ansible engine, is key here, right? So for both these parsers, that allows you to take show command outputs from your playbook and plug it into the parser and collect the parsed output and plug it back into your playbook for subsequent tasks seamlessly, right? So there's no need to write another module and passing variables and trying to figure out how the variables are being passed between the different components. All those things you don't have to take care. Ansible takes care of all those things for you. It makes it very easy to use. You just need to focus on trying to figure out a regular expression to parse the information that you're trying to collect. The command parser, by downloading the command parser, you just keep in mind that does not mean that you're getting pre-written parsers. You still have to write your parsers, and I will talk towards the end about a call for action for building a community of such parsers. It does not require you to learn a new domain-specific language. We have to deal with regular expressions. That is unfortunately the restrictions that equipment vendors have placed on us, right? So until we have structured data coming back directly from the devices, we have to use regular expressions. So that's something that we will need to continue doing. And yeah, absolutely no magic here. Next slide. So what does the parse output look like? I tried to capture those three same commands that I showed at the beginning, right? The show IP interface brief, the phase one ASA details, and the Linux interface ifconfig command output. And you can see how that blob of text was converted into structured data through this command parser. So this slide is just to show how that same piece of information comes back as nested objects. And once we have nested objects, we know that it is easy to navigate this data structure and find the relevant piece of information that we need. All right. So now let's see how to write the command parsers. Next slide. Next slide. So in this slide, I want to first help people who are seeing this kind of visualize what is a command parser, right? So what does a command parser look like? What does a command parser look like? I said that it's a YAML-based template. So when you look at it without even knowing anything about command parsers at this point, it looks very much like a Ansible playbook, right? So we'll break this down and we'll understand the different components. But at this point, just want you to understand that it is a relatively straightforward a piece of YAML data structure. Next slide. So this slide shows you how you would use the command parser template once you build it. So if you look at this particular playbook, you can see that the first thing, and unfortunately I'm not able to point with my mouse here, but the first thing that's needed is the role, right? So the Ansible Network Engine role is a requirement in order to use the command parser. So we include that role at the top of the playbook. After that, once that role has been included, we run our normal show command on the device. So the first task there is collecting the output of the show IP interface brief command on a Cisco device. And it is collecting that output into a variable called output, right? So that task is pretty normal, standard Ansible. The second task that is highlighted in red is the one that's using the command parser, right? So the command parser, if you remember, I said is nothing but an action plugin, right? So you're basically using it just like a normal Ansible module, and it takes two parameters to send data into the parsing engine. One is the content, right? So the content is going to be the raw data, right? So the raw data which we captured in the previous command inside that variable called output, we send that as the input to the command parser. The next piece of information the command parser needs is the actual parser template itself, right? And we just saw the parser template in the slide previously, in the previous slide. So once you write the parser template, using the parser template inside your playbook is very, very, very simple, right? So you just plug in these two pieces of information. It's almost similar to like the template module where you pass with the template and the data. Next slide. So this workflow that I built is more or less based on my personal experience working with command parser, right? So this is kind of the pattern I follow while writing a new parser template. The first thing I do is try and create a regular expression match for the data I'm trying to collect, right? And for that I use websites like regex 101 or regexer.com or any one of those websites that unless you are already a good regular expression person who doesn't really need the help of those kind of websites. But that's my I'm not a regular expression expert, but that's where I go to help build those regular expressions. And then I use the various parser directives, and I'll talk about parser directives in the next slide, in a couple of slides. But I use the parser directives that's provided by the command parser parsing engine. And then I check whether my regular expressions are returning the data that I desire, and is it coming back to me in the format that I desire by exporting those variables in multiple stages. And then finally, once I'm satisfied with how my data is being formatted and whether I'm collecting all the right pieces of information, I finally build and export the final data structure. Okay, next slide.
So Ajay, real quick,
yeah.
When you build and export, when you export the data structure, where's the best place to put this? Is it in Git or a database, or what's a good practice for where people actually put this stuff?
So for the parser templates themselves, ideally you want to create a role that has a collection of your parser templates so that you can just reuse these parser templates across your organization. And in fact, towards the end of the slide deck, there's a link to a Git repository that we are slowly building, right? So right now we have a bunch of parsers for the NXOS, but we're trying to collect more and more parsers, both from community and internally, to collectively add to the number of parsers that we have.
Okay, thanks.
Does that make sense? Yeah. And specifically from an export standpoint, when we look at a parser, when we look at an actual parser template, you'll see how the export is being used, and that'll make more sense. When you invoke the export is nothing but a parser directive, and export allows you to export the parsed data from the parser template back into the playbook. And when we see an example, it'll make sense. All right, so this is the first step in my workflow, is to build a regular expression, right? So here you can see in the text box, I've taken one line of output from the show IP interface brief output, and then on the top I've built the regular expression, and on the right side you can see all the different matches, right? So at this point I can tell, okay, these are the different pieces of information that I need. I have my regular expression built. So I'd go to the next step, which is the next slide.
So is this an application? How are you building these? Is a question. How are these? Is this a web page? What tool are you using to do this?
Yeah. So this particular slide is a screenshot from regex101.com. It's regex101.com. So it's an online regular expression parsing tool, right? So there's a ton of them, right? I just use regex101. There's regexer.com. There's there's like a ton of, so if you just Google for a regular expression tool, you'll find one that you like, but I use regex101. Yep.
Okay.
And you don't have to use this. I mean, if you already know regular expressions well enough, you probably don't need to use this. But this is my workflow. Next slide. So now that I've built my regular expression, I wanted to talk about the different parser directives that are being used inside that particular parser template, right? So the command parser supports these 4 parser directives. It supports pattern match, pattern group, JSON template, and export facts. So the pattern match is the most basic parser directive. What a pattern match is going to do is it's going to match against a particular regular expression pattern, right? It's going to match the data that you send the template against the regular expression that's coded inside the template. So that's what a pattern match does. A pattern group, on the other hand, allows you to build a more complex pattern grouping. So what I mean by that is, an example usually helps with this. So for the example of a show IP interface brief, I don't need to use pattern group. I can use pattern match, and I can collect all the information that I need. Pattern group is typically used when I have similar data over multiple times. So if I was to do the show interfaces, or if I was to do show IP BGP, right? So the command output will be, so the show IP BGP command output, I would see information on a per neighbor, right? And if I do show interfaces on a Cisco router, I would get information on a per interface basis. So there would be a similar data for each interface, right? So there's going to be a bunch of patterns that we want to match for a particular interface, and then move on to the next interface. And then we want to group all this as one final data structure. So that's an example of when you would use pattern groups. The JSON template parser directive is used to create the final structure that we like, so that we can pass it back into our playbook. And export facts allows you to actually export that final structure back into your playbook. So next slide. So that parser template that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, that had the complete parser template. This one is broken down into just the first pattern match, the very first parser directive that we are using, right? So that here you can see that we're using the pattern match parser directive. We are providing it the regular expression that we just built using our regexer tool, right? And we are collecting the output using the register into a variable called section. And now notice that we are using the next parser directive, which is export, right? So here we are specifying, or we're telling the parser template to export this parsed result back into the playbook, right? So on the right-hand side, you can see the debug output for the variable called section, right? So when you look at the variable called section, you can see right there the word section as well in the output. And you can see that we are already getting structured data back, right? So we can see Ethernet 0/0 and 0/1 with all the different pieces of information that we need. Now, while this is good enough, maybe, right? So it is still structured data. You're not dealing with blobs of text. This is still relatively hard to parse from a repeated standpoint, right? So the idea is you can restructure this same data to make better sense, so that whoever is consuming this data can actually make more sense of it. So that's where you would use a parser directive like JSON template. So next slide. So in this slide, you can see I have removed the export yes for the first parser directive, right? So you can see on the left-hand side that pattern match, regex, and register section, all that information is still there, but I've removed the export clause for that particular parser directive, and I've moved the export to the next section, right? And then in the next section, you can see that I'm using the JSON template parser directive, and the JSON template parser directive is actually looping through the variable that was created in the previous parser directive, right? So you can see how in the first parser directive, we are collecting the parse output into a variable called section. And you could, from the previous slide, you can tell that it was a list of dictionaries. So in the next parser directive, we are passing that section variable through the loop directive into the JSON template parser directive. So the JSON template parser directive, what it does is it allows you to construct a structured object the way you want it, right? So on the right-hand side, if you look at the output of the debug for the variable that we are exporting now, which is IP interface facts, you can see that it is slightly more easier to read this data, right? So here, the key for all the parsed output has the interface name. So Ethernet 0/0.11 is the interface name, and that acts as the key, and it has associated data beneath it, right? You could get this same data from the previous data structure as well, but then you have to write more intelligence to figure out which interface you're dealing with and so on, right? So you're able to build a slightly more intelligent data structure using the JSON template parser directive. And to me, I think this is really, really key, especially for organizations that are just getting started with automation, right? And having come from a large enterprise, one of the challenges that hiring managers have is, they're expected to start automating their environments, right? And hiring becomes a challenge. Do you hire developers, or do you and teach them networking, or do you teach your networking engineers programming, right? And I've run into situations where programmers have been hired, and the first thing a programmer comes and asks the network engineer is, okay, I'd like to automate your network devices, so can you give me the API endpoint to your switch? And the network engineer goes like, what API? What API does my 3750 switch have, right? So when you run into situations like that, to me, this actually makes network engineers really, really powerful, because you are able to use the command parser and build these pseudo APIs, right? So you can provide your Ansible playbook through Tower or however it is, right? So ideally so once you write your playbook and put it into Tower becomes an API endpoint, and if you're able to present this data back to a programmer who's doing higher level automation or integration across multiple systems, they're able to consume this data to make more intelligent business decisions than having to go down into the CLI, right? So as a network engineer, it kind of elevates your position from being a person who just manages network devices to being someone who's able to work with the development organization to kind of empower some of the business processes automation. Next slide.
One quick question is, someone asked if the outputs are out of order. The first key, first is key name, but the output looks like key item matches 0. Are they out of order? I might have to find out there.
Yeah. I'm trying to. I don't think so, because the variable section is a list, right? So we're going through one interface at a time. So if Ethernet 0/0.11 was the first item in the list, that is the one that's going to be created. However, the data for that itself is a dictionary, right? So if you look at the data key, the values inside that are key value pairs, and that's a dictionary. And when you're working with dictionaries, the order of dictionaries don't matter. So I'm not sure if I caught that question correctly, but if the question is around the order of what the keys inside the dictionary are, it really should not matter. But from an IP interface fact standpoint, if you look at that variable IP interface facts, that itself is a list, and their order matters. So the first interface is always going to be Ethernet 0/0.11, and the second one is going to be Ethernet 0/1. Yep.
Okay. So we may have to follow up. I think there's still a question as why it's not, the order isn't matching up. But
okay. Yeah.
We'll have to figure that out. We'll have to figure that out. Okay.
Yeah, against what is okay. So okay. The next slide is really a call to action. So if you go to the next slide, Andrew. So we have a GitHub repo that's started, right? So we are building a role, right? So there's going to be a role called Parser Templates. So this Parser Templates will automatically depend on the network engine role, right? So from an Ansible Galaxy standpoint, if you're not already familiar with the Ansible Galaxy ecosystem, once this role, this role is already in Galaxy, but as it becomes more populated with more and more Parser templates from the community and from folks inside Red Hat as well, you can just install this role, and it'll install all the dependencies for you, and then these Parser templates become available for your playbook, right? So if you have to parse the output of show IP interface brief, you don't have to write your own parser, right? Somebody's already written it for you, right? And at the same time, if you're working with a device that maybe not everybody works with, and if you have a parser template that will be beneficial to the community, this would be a great place for folks to come and submit a pull request against as well, right? So we are still working on building the testing for this. So we'd like to use Molecule to test these roles. So if that's something that interests you, also feel free to get open source contributions. So that's really the presentation about command parsers.
That's good. Question is, do you have some real world applications of what people actually do with parsed data, and what do people actually do once they have it? What are some powerful use cases? I mean, there's some good ideas for where to put the stuff. Is there, is it state data? Is it some people are automating or pseudo automating. They're not fully automated. Some people are still hitting devices directly on the side. How is this actually applicable to some of the things you've seen in the field?
So I can tell you two examples from my own work experience, and then I can tell you some examples that I've seen other customers use, right? So the first example I used was, and this might date me based on what all the cool people are doing these days, but was to map out the spanning tree in my data center, right? So we had these massive global data centers. So writing a playbook that would simply run the same show commands that a human would do in order to map out which ports are forwarding and which ports are blocking, which port channels where, or how many interfaces are in a port channel, what was the typical usage pattern of a particular link, right? All these utilization information, all that, right? So collecting all the output of these show commands across the multiple switches inside my data center, I was able to build out a HTML page, or even, to begin with, it was just a markdown page. And then, as we get time, we iterate over it, make it a CSV file, or make it a, HTML page, right? So once you have this sparse data, you can use Ginger 2 templating and convert that into any kind of report you would like, right? So we had this report that would show the way the spanning tree was laid out for our data center, and we would run it periodically, right? So whenever there was an incident in the data center, it was easy to tell somebody to rerun this playbook and quickly eliminate layer 1, layer 2 issues, right? So you can almost immediately eliminate spanning tree issues or narrow it down to spanning tree issue by just building this report. Makes the life of operations super powerful, right? That's one great use case. The other one was to build compliance reports, right? So every now and then I was asked, either it was, operating system information, right? It was like, okay, can you go and see which of these switches are out of compliance, right? So all the switches have to be at a particular operating system version. So having a job that just does, well, that one you can do with just the facts module. You don't need to use command parser, but in general, from an idea standpoint, just getting structured data from your devices and finding out what version your devices are and building a report out of it, right? So you're able to build a HTML report at a high level for E levels and for your own engineering teams. Depending on the persona, right? You can have different levels of information there, right? You can have green, red kind of information versus you can have deep down information as to what version of operating system is running on each of these devices. Other things like, okay, check whether DPDU guard is enabled on all these devices, right? You add a new device, you want to make sure that something is not missing, right? So rerun the report against devices. I guess I can go on really, like BGP information. I've seen people use parsing information from basic commands like show IP BGP summary, just to make sure that the number of prefixes that are received or advertised match what is expected, right? So from a source of truth. So comparing against your source of truth would be another good example of comparing parse data. So checking your operational state data against expectations, right? So that's a great place to use command parsers. I don't know.
Cool.
Thanks would be some examples. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, I know there's probably lots more there, and we actually have some questions coming in now.
Okay.
Two kind of similar from two different people.
Okay.
Some questions are, the parser. Maybe we've oversimplified this, and maybe that's great, but there's a lot of folks are asking, is the command parser network specific, and why is it only for networking, or can it be used for non-networking? Why is it being bundled with Network Engine? And I think the idea here is we never really talked about providers, and maybe that's why. So maybe you can touch on a little bit of the guts on how that is, if you can.
Yeah. So command parsers is currently bundled with the Ansible Network Engine, right? And the idea is to have these platform level providers that are tied in to provide the other functional roles of the Ansible Network Engine itself. But in my experience, there is no reason that you cannot use command parser with any kind of raw text that you want to parse, right? So even in the examples that I show, I use the ifconfig command output from a Linux machine, right? So while there is no network engine provider for Linux at this point, it really does not matter, right? So you can actually still use the command parser to write Parser templates that are not just specific to network devices. In fact, that's one of the things I've been talking to my colleagues about internally as well, is trying to see what would be relevant information for system administrators, right, who have the relevant background, right? So I personally don't have enough system administration background to know what would be good commands that's not already being collected by the gather facts modules that come as part of Ansible, right? So trying to see what commands would have some value to write command parsers for us, right? So long answer, but the short answer to that question is there is really no restriction. You can use the command parser to run against or to parse text from any equipment, any operating system.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it's bundled with Network Engine is because Network Engine is a role, because we bundled it as a role so that you didn't have to worry about having to have something included as part of Ansible, the project you don't have to wait 6 to 8 months for updates to the parser or the engine, right? So the idea was this use case is highly needed for network operators and engineers. We made it as network engine as a role so that we could actually update it weekly. We actually update it on a weekly basis every Tuesday. So roles are updated regularly, and we weren't bound by the actual roadmap or kind of release schedule of the Ansible project, right? So that's kind of the why, two different reasons why there. So hopefully that answers your question. Next question, Ajay, is maybe this is a review. I may have missed the part. Why not stick to text FSM for commands parsing instead of command parser? And I think maybe you could just refresh on that one piece.
Yeah, absolutely. You can use text FSM, right? And text FSM also is an included parsing engine as part of the network engine role, right? So you can use either. So there are two parsing engines that are provided as part of the network engine role. One is the command parser, and the other is the text FSM parser, right? So this talk was mostly about the command parser, but if you're already familiar with text FSM and if you're using text FSM and you're comfortable with the domain-specific language of text FSM, absolutely, right? In my opinion, before command parser, text FSM was the only available engine that was around, right? So all templates are written using the text FSM parser, and I've used it quite extensively. I've taught people that parser quite extensively, but I still believe that one of the biggest challenges with the text FSM parser personally is that once you write a parser and you try and revisit it after a period of time, it feels like a different language or you're trying to figure out what exactly you wrote 6 months ago, right? So unless you use it on a daily basis, I find it hard to remember, and from a user experience standpoint, I find command parsers to be a lot more easier to work with personally.
Okay, great, thanks. Got a question here. How does Ansible handle login to network devices, especially if the device is based on RSA tokens? Okay.
So for network devices, typically Ansible uses a plugin called Network CLI, right, which is ultimately based on SSH connection when you break it down. There are other protocols like netconf and API-based systems that use other protocols, but for the majority, it's Network CLI that uses SSH. Now, in particular, the question seems to be around how do you work with things that have that are TACACs and that depend on a token. So the answer to that is you're going to need to use a service account that is associated with your automation project or automation tool that will be used as a static username and password to log into the device. So this is particularly important if you are dealing with enterprises, right? You need to have audit trail. How are you going to enforce audit trail if you have a static username and password? So the way I've solved for that in the past in my work is by using Ansible Tower, right? So Ansible Tower would provide me a role-based access control that would control username and password information as who logged into Tower and then who kicked off a job template. The job template itself might be using the service account that is tied with the TACACS device. Now, keep in mind that this is not a unique requirement for Ansible, right? So if you have any monitoring system in your environment, or if you have any other automation system in your environment, all these devices use exactly the same process. Now, worst case, let's say you're not allowed to have a service account, you can still use a momentary username and password, but that becomes almost impractical, right? So it becomes tied with your the RSA token, right? So you would type in your username and put in your RSA token, and your playbook would run for the validity of that that token, right? So if your automation is trying to automate 100 devices, but your token's life is 30 seconds, right? Your automation might succeed only for a percentage of these devices, and then it would start failing. Right? So it's almost a not practical solution for automation systems.
Okay, great, thanks. There's a question is, where should people be focusing efforts if a device is netconf enabled? Should folks be using netconf or not using netconf? Since the connection plugins kind of dictate there. I think I'll take a stab at it, and then Ajay, you can say is, right now, for example, if you're an iOS XR customer, you do have the ability to use either use regular iOS XR modules, or using over network CLI, or over using netconf, right? We do actually have that. We kind of don't dictate which one to do. It's more of the community and the market kind of dictates that. Both are supported and enabled by Ansible, by Red Hat. So I don't know if there's some field. If you have something, Ajay, if there's whatever you're seeing in the field, are you seeing a lot of netconf in customer sites?
No, most of the customers I deal with are usually running Cisco iOS devices, and it also depends on how mature the netconf implementation on the products are, right? So I know that, for example, on Juniper devices, they have a very mature netconf ecosystem, and in that case, I would recommend to use netconf as your protocol of choice when you're automating those devices. If you're working with products that are introducing netconf, or netconf is still experimental, I would say stick with traditional login and access methods, right? So ultimately, netconf would be a better way to manage your devices than CLI over SSH, right? So I would say, depending on the maturity of your product, device, and your confidence level, and if you as a team are using netconf to manage these devices, and you're comfortable managing it with netconf, like Andres said, there's nothing that we support both, right? So we support both protocols as a way to manage the devices.
Yeah, I think we're going to have time for one more. We have to call it short. I know there's a lot of questions. Sorry we didn't get to them. If you asked a question and we didn't get to it, highly recommend you join. There's an IRC meeting every Wednesday. It's a community meeting on IRC, Ansible Network. You can actually Google for it. If you just Google Ansible Network Community Meeting, it should show up on Wednesdays on IRC. The last question is, and this dovetails into netconf. If you have netconf, does Ansible have modules to work with Yang data models? So if you've already kind of signed up for the netconf connection plugin, going one step further, are there tools to actually connect with the Yang data models? And I'll say answer is yes. There is a Yang role. If you actually go into github.com/Ansible-network, there is, in the same place where network engine lives, is also a Yang role as well. So Ajay, I don't know if you've used that Yang role, but I know that's one that's available. Okay. With that, I really appreciate your time. We're going to schedule the next one in about 3 months. Ajay, I want to say thank you for co-hosting, and everyone else for participating. We will have this is being recorded. It will be posted. The slides will be posted. Feel free to join us in IRC every Wednesday if you have any other questions, and we'll talk to you the next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the patience.